Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is TBSky. There is a new League of Legends animation video out, and you know what that means if you've been following this channel for a while. I'm going to be spending some time talking about it. Now, I'm not primarily a 3D animation person. I am not, as I've mentioned in previous videos, intimately familiar with the 3D animation techniques. I'm substantially more familiar with 2D animation, which is what I can comment on better when it comes to stuff like what program did they use to do this thing, or how did they achieve that effect, or how did they do this or that. But what I can comment on is more basic stuff, something like the little movement details that they use, or in the case of this particular video, I'd like to talk something about the transitions that they use between their segments, because they are, from a filmmaking perspective, really quite clever. Now, the basic plot of the animation as it is tremendously basic. It's a series of very short vignettes featuring one or two characters doing something typically combat related, fighting for their lives, because the theme of the thing is the climb against impossible odds to achieve greatness, which cut away to each other through some rather imaginative little visual sequences, like for instance this one here, which we're going to talk about in due time. But I just want to say that I'm a little bit salty that Riot are going to show that clearly Illaoi is somewhere around here, and yet is not going to get even a second of screen time. Really? Illaoi, my girl? You just going to do her like that? Fair enough. Fine, I guess. Okay. So the animation itself is, as usual with Riot, it's a high-quality piece of work. They have some tremendously talented people on their animations team, and as like everybody else in the League of Legends community, I wish that they would use them more, that there would be, as there have been now countless petitions on the subreddit to make a short film or do a thing with Netflix or something, which, yeah, they should, but they're not gonna, because they're Riot, and that is not their way. Or maybe they will eventually, but it's not gonna be soon. Trademark. So let's take a look at the thing as it is. And let's start with Yasuo's very dirty hands. Now, one of the things that is kind of fundamental to, well, cartoons, essentially, or comics art, is the tension between realism and abstraction. That is to say, how much do you want something to look like real life, and how much do you want it to look like something fantastical? And this is a tension that League of Legends always, I won't say struggles with, because they've struck an incredibly nice balance between the two, but it's a tension that is you always have to keep in mind when you're assessing League of Legends artwork, or indeed their aesthetic, or indeed the aesthetic of video games as a whole, because they constantly have to make those choices between what do we make realistic and what do we keep cartoonish and sort of unreal, a little bit in outside of what is reality. Because the trouble is, if you get that balance wrong, you end up straight to the hell in the uncanny valley, which is where you don't want to go, because that's when your design looks unbelievable. It looks like it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. Characters wouldn't look like that. Something is wrong about them when you hit that spot between being not quite realistic enough, but also too realistic somehow. And I bring that up because, well, one of the first things we see in this video is the decidedly dirty hands of Yasuo rendered with loving detail against some very high detailed skin and smudge effects, and someone spent a hell of a lot of time putting this shot together, I have to say. But there is a contrast in reality against the armor pieces that he is wearing, because I don't know if you've handled a lot of steel in your time, but I can tell you that most metals, when you make a sheet of them that is that thick and solid, this does not appear to be hollow in the least. That's really, like, just really heavy. But look at the way the armor pieces on Yasuo's costume move as he makes his movements, especially look at the ones on his shoulder. Look how almost weightless they are. Look how little weight they seem to put on his body, how little he seems to be stressed by having to carry 3 solid giant metal arm pieces around that protect his shoulder. And here we have the tension between realistic and cartoonish, because if this was rendered to be realistic, if the character was designed to be realistic, I can tell you he would not stand up the way that he does. Look at the motion when he stands up. Look how even and how smooth and how controlled it is. Because, of course, this is his character, but imagine if you had 3 giant pieces of metal hanging off your shoulder like that. How would you stand up? You would stand up the same way you do when you have a heavy bag hanging on your shoulder or something. You would be slanted to one side, kind of dragging it up after you. But Yasuo isn't. And because the weight of the thing seems to have no visible effect on him, it becomes a little cartoonish. It becomes almost like it's made of paper mache or aluminium, or aluminum, if you prefer. Which, of course, it isn't. And now, none of this breaks the immersion. That's the brilliant part of animation like this, is that none of it makes us go, oh, that's complete, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't take us into the uncanny valley, but it strikes the balance between, yeah, this is a ridiculous cartoon design, but we're going to choose to render certain features like his face, like all the little strands of hair and the light effects and the fraying around the edges of his cape with realism, and make that behave the way that real material of that kind would if you arranged it in these configurations. But the giant metal plates, well, we're just gonna make them look big and bulky, but then we're gonna have them move around like they're made of paper mache or nothing, like they're not really a weight to him. It also has the added benefit of, if you start thinking about how the hell could he possibly carry that stuff around, then the obvious answer presents itself. Oh, right, he's really strong because he's a champion. So it all kind of blends together very nicely. And that's a really difficult it's a really difficult balance to strike, because this is something I've always had a bit of trouble with stuff in the WarCraft style. In the WarCraft shorts, if you notice their animations, when characters show up wearing really heavy armor, they tend to move like they're wearing really heavy armor. This is true also of stuff like Warhammer 40k, or just Warhammer in general. Characters with armor as big and thick as this will tend to move appropriately to it, because for their aesthetic to make sense, for their aesthetic to work, because generally speaking, something like Warhammer 40k is less cartoonish, and for Warhammer, they've always had that big, bulky, heavy feel going on in their aesthetic. That makes more sense in order for them to achieve the aesthetic they're looking for. But here with League of Legends, we're not looking for the heavy thing, which is very much part of what the WarCraft aesthetic especially. We're not looking for that heavy, bulky, very... It's weird with WarCraft because they strive for a reality to their universe that League of Legends shorts don't do. Now, it's easy when you look at a League of Legends short and the WarCraft short to kind of say, oh, they're in the same space, like they're the same kind of aesthetic. It's fantasy 3D animation aesthetic. But really, when you compare a League of Legends short to a WarCraft short, they're not in the same space at all. WarCraft shorts are much more focused on making the world look much more real, less cartoony. League of Legends shorts lean into the cartoonishness, to the Saturday morning, like, thing of it all. And by the way, how cool is it that they somehow managed to get away with appropriating a shot from I Am Legend? No, not I Am Legend. What the hell? Hero. That's the seminal Chinese action movie work. I can't remember the director, but from Hero. Like, that whole thing about the arrows blanketing out the sky, I believe that was pioneered in that film. And then they subvert it. Like, because if you remember from the movie Hero, one of the times when a character is about to be struck by a rain of arrows, it genuinely does kill him. I'm not sure if that was the explicit reference that we're going for. It's just the tiny bit of film nerdery that I've got in me compels me to point out that they're grabbing that thing from one of the most famous Chinese-produced action movies of all time, one of the most famous Asian-produced action movies of all time, and using it in the League of Legends short, which is something, I suspect is something they did just to kind of show appreciation for the Asian market a little bit. I think that might be part of the rationale for why they put it in here. Now, YouTube's compression is a bitch, but I wanted to talk for a second about how they use motion blur. Now, a lot of the blur that you're seeing on the screen right now comes from the fact that YouTube has compressed this video beyond recognizability. I really wish Riot would release like proper high-quality 1080p clear video files that haven't been like completely fucked by compression. But look at the way they use motion blur. This blur right here, for instance, and a lot of the blur around the armor, that is not generated by the YouTube algorithm. That's something they've put in there in order to heighten the motion of the sword, especially because he's moving very fast right now, and it can be really hard to read what he's doing. So see what they're doing here. Little streaks of light indicating where the sword goes, showing the slash of the sword as he sets up the wind wall, all arranged in this arc that kind of helps define his motion around. And because you see this white streak, that's not the 3D model of the sword. They've added that effect in order to tell us where the sword is, what direction it's moving, in order to emphasize the rotation and the power of his movement as he raises the wind wall. And it's an interesting effect they've chosen for the wind wall, because that's something that's actually kind of hard to do, because wind is by its nature invisible, so how the hell do you show it without making it look like he's putting up a magic barrier? And what they've chosen to do is essentially contrast the falling motion of the arrows, right? The arrows are black streaks coming down from above, and the wind wall is a series of white or bluish white streaks coming down from below. So there's this contrast of color, and there's a contrast of motion that helps sell the idea that this is a barrier that's rising up and pushing them away. Something else, by the way, since we were talking about the tension between heightened reality and cartoonishness and reality, look how lovingly rendered, how realistically rendered all the plants and flowers are in this scene. Like, this is some seriously high density, it's close to photorealistic kind of stuff. That's easier to do with flowers than with people without hitting the uncanny valley. But that's another one of the aesthetic choices that kind of define a lot of the Riot shorts, is that they have this, we make the environment look extremely real and believable, and then we place characters into that environment that just don't look quite as realistic, that look cartoonish, that look heightened. Let's see, is there anything else interesting to talk about? Maybe when Yasuo runs. There, see, when I started this video out, I figured I don't really have that much to talk about. I'm just going to talk about some of the transitions between scenes, and now it's 11 minutes later, and I've barely gotten past the first 25 seconds of this fucking thing. But the interesting thing, again, look how they use bright light and reflections to guide your eye, right? He has thrown out the wind wall, and now look how his sword is constantly alight with glowy effects as he dashes into the run, which is good because everything now becomes visual chaos. Partly because of the compression algorithm on YouTube, but also just because of the motion that we're put into. This is an extremely strong, fast dash. They really need to sell the illusion of speed, so what they do is, bump my mic there, is use that light effect from the sword to kind of guide our eyes to his motion until we can get a glimpse of this. And then once we pan out to the side, we can really see what he's actually doing. At which point, you notice how every time they need to sell a really quick motion, what they like to do is highlight it somehow so that the eye can follow what the hell is going on. And now here we come to the transitions, which are the thing I actually want to talk about. The transition from Yasuo to Talia, which is interesting because they have a lore connection, comes in the form of a dust cloud, right? Something explodes on the battlefield, God knows what, throws up a dust cloud, and that dust cloud is used to mask the cut where we get into Talia. But it also masks the transitioning color scheme. See, when we're here with Yasuo, everything has these bright, very saturated nature colors, a lot of pink mountains and red trees and stuff going on. And that's how the cloud starts. It's got a lot of red tones in it, but then as the you can see the color tone changes right here. From pink to blue. And then it slowly transitions as we get into Talia's world. It introduces the sand and the brown colors. And it uses that contrast of color to indicate to the viewer that we have transitioned into a different scene. This is a new place. It doesn't have the same colors, so we are in a new place. Which helps reduce the confusion, because if there wasn't that clear transition of color from one place to the other, when Talia pops out of the dust cloud, we might be, hold on, wait a minute, did he transform? What the hell happened? No. We have this cue, this visual cue that tells us we're in another world. And one of the other interesting little things I noticed was in this explosion. See, because I noticed some of the effects that were going on. I was interested in taking a closer look at them. Because the electricity effects around some of these explosions, and it's clearly Serath that she's fighting right now, which makes sense because she's in Shurima. They kind of look hand-painted. I can't be sure, but something Riot has done a lot with a lot of the explosion effects. If you look at the Get Jinxed video, they have done hand-painted explosion effects around a lot of their magic effects going on, which is interesting because that, again, is something that gives it a heightened cartoon sense of feel rather than a realistic feel. I don't know if that's what they've done here because I can't really get a clear and close enough look at it, but I'd be interested to know. I've got a bit of bronchitis, so you'll have to excuse occasional coughing. Now, let's see what Talia does. The interesting thing about the Talia bit of the short is all the motion of the camera. The camera kind of moves like we are surfing next to her, if you notice. As we come out of the cloud, we are kind of... It's almost like someone with a GoPro is next to her, kind of following her around on a rope or something like that, swooping in front of her and behind her. But notice how the camera, especially from the start, we exit the Yasuo scene looking at him from this side, from his right side, and we enter the Talia scene looking at her from her right side. So the motion of Yasuo moving across the battlefield here transitions us smoothly into the motion of Talia going left to right across the screen, essentially. And then the camera can start swinging around, but it's important that it keeps that steady shot from the Yasuo short as it transitions, otherwise it can get confusing. And I'm really impressed with how well they managed to swing the camera around without making it too confusing, because if the camera had been spinning around Talia and going just a little bit more crazy than it is, I think the short would have been really disorienting, especially with all the sand and the explosion effects going on. But it chooses to give us a point of orientation. She's in a canyon, not a desert. There's a canyon, there's a clear sort of corridor thing going on, which is why she's having a hard time dodging some of Serath's shots, or why she seems like she's trying very hard to dodge his shots. And it also creates a sense of claustrophobia, which heightens the sense of danger, which is a good choice. Interested in Talia's movements, because this is part of what Talia's costume is for, even in-game as well, is it helps heighten a lot of what Talia's movements are in-game, and certainly in this short, is very circular weaving motions. She's the stone weaver. She weaves things together. So there's a lot of these big circular swoops and round motions going on, kind of like waterbenders in Avatar: The Last Airbender. And the two long sleeves of her coat are designed to help heighten that. As you can see when she does this swooping motion, see how her coat almost describes a perfect circle that then leads into the big swoop, and you can see as the stone pillars rise from over here, they mimic the same sort of curve that her coat is describing, which is a visual thing that helps imply, and it helps tell us as the audience that there's an affinity between these two things, that this thing describes a half circle, that thing describes a half circle. There's some sort of relationship between them. Oh, she's the one pulling the stones out of the ground. And it's not a difficult leap to make. We're used to that kind of thing, but it's a nice little bit of filmmaking technique to just kind of imply that there's a connection between these two things to ensure that we know when stones rise out of the ground, that's not the enemy, that's her. So let's see what else we can go. By the way, I love the way they've modeled her. It's a really interesting... A lot of League of Legends characters, especially characters like Zoe and young children characters, they run the risk of looking too Disney. But what they've done with Talia is, again, we have this tension between realism and cartoonishness, because her costume is way cartoonish, like the almost feather-like cowl of rocks that she's got going on. But then the face is rendered with just the right amount of realism to make her more than a cartoon character, but still without dipping entirely into the uncanny valley. I think they cut it really close with Talia, really close to the uncanny valley, but they don't go over, and that makes her visual design is more interesting, I think, than most of the recent Disney girl designs. Like, it's much less abstracted. It feels more real. It feels more like you can encounter someone in the real world who has a face like that, even if her eyes are a lot bigger than most real humans. And speaking of her motion, look at this. See, when she pulls the weaver's wall, she literally pulls it, right? Like a weaver would pull string through cloth. So look at the motion she enters. Again, all the motion blur just fucking ruining things for me. But again, the coat flying down this way emphasizes the swoop of her arm, that she's swooping her arm back. And you can see the strain as she pulls. She heaves it, pulls it out of the ground, and then throws it ahead of her, which is such a good way to do this kind of... Because the trouble with doing magic a lot of the time is that by its very nature, magic is you snap your fingers and a thing happens. So how do you establish a physical connection between the person doing the magic and the magic as it happens? And one of the ways, this is how Star Wars likes to do it with the Force, by the way, is to show the character making a visible effort to pull the magic effect out of the world, like Luke straining like a maniac for his lightsaber in the cave with a wampa or whatever it may be. The physical effect of using... Here, maybe we get a better look at the lightning effects. The physical strain of using magic. Again, I'm not quite sure. No, I don't. I actually think... Yeah, no, I think the effects on the magic here are actually 3D generated somehow. Certainly those lighting effects are. That's a little disappointing. I would have liked to see them use the 2D cartoon thing more. And again, like we talked about with Yasuo, right? There's a color transition. As Talia, and again, this is part of why the coat is such a brilliant move, because it kind of spreads out behind her like wings, and it heightens the sense of speed as she's zooming along on her rock. But again, there's a transition of color from all the reds and browns that are generally going on in Talia's world, and then we get this transition into the noxious, saturated greens of Noxus. And in fact, Talia goes with us. She is still here, riding through Noxus now somehow, until a dust cloud obscures her, and her motion, the momentum that she has, is taken over by Echo's ghosts. And by the way, this is something I missed the first time I saw this short. You see how the ghosts of Echo... I missed it. I don't know if everybody else missed it, but I wanted to point out that the ghosts of Echo here are reenacting his fall. So this is Echo using his ultimate to get back on a platform after he's taken a bad fall, gets back up on the platform, pulls the C drive, and then he starts getting out of the way. And I love the way they did the transition from... Because they do something rather clever here from a visual perspective. You can see as he's about to get hit by the bolt. Let's see if I can find a frame where it starts here. This is the frame where his ghost effect starts. And all they really do is the same thing they do in-game. They leave a snapshot of him behind. And the last part of Echo, his real body that leaves the ghost, is his legs here on this frame. His body itself kind of ducks out, but the last thing that leaves is his legs, which helps make him planted. It helps make the ghost feel planted so that it doesn't feel floaty. It feels more like he's kind of leaving a shadow behind. Which is a small thing, but a really nice one, I think. And it's helped by, you can see the cloud of acid that bursts up as Echo ducks out of the way, helps kind of obscure him. He's kind of hidden as he dodges into cover, which again is a nice little, explains why they don't just immediately fire at him again. Which they do there as soon as the ghost disappears. And Blitzcrank. I love how Blitzcrank looks in this thing. Look at those smoke effects, or, yeah, well, I guess they're technically steam effects. And again, yeah, I think they've switched to... Yeah, they're fully 3D animating the effects now. Oh well, what a bother. But anyway, I wanted to point out that the first part of what Echo's doing is him using his ult to negate damage, which is why when he's stupid and doesn't realize he can't keep jumping on these guys forever, he tries to pull his ultimate in order to get back out of it. It's like, holy, oh fuck, my cooldown is still on. And here we get into the next transition. And here's, again, we have this transition of motion. Echo is falling down, and as he hits... and as he hits the glass, and all the shards pop out around him. First of all, we cut to white, which is always a good way to transition. But all the falling glass shards, you can see this is still glass, become bubbles instead. And those bubbles, we have another color transition into the dark teal and dark bluish greens of the watery abyss. As we see Misfortune, who's continuing Echo's motion. His motion is falling down with his back first. Back first, boom, down, And Misfortune also falling with her back first and her limbs out in front of her as she's falling down. And again, as we talked about the tension between realism and cartoonishness, a lot of stuff in this shot is cartoonish, but the motion of Misfortune's hair in the water is painfully realistic. Like, it's very much rendered with the idea, this is the part of it that we need, because we can't just have bubbles on the screen all the time. We need something to really sell us on the idea that she's underwater, and because she has this long hair, it's perfect for that. Don't know if there's that much more to talk about in the Misfortune bit. I do like the transition of the camera from... because we're always... for most of the bit of Misfortune on screen, we're looking at her from above. We're looking down on her, literally. And as she climbs up, you can see the transition in the light. She is going towards sunlight, which is clearly somewhere up above. And it's the moment when she goes past us and reaches for her gun. And she becomes empowered because now she has her weapon again. That's when we stop looking down at her, which is, again, from a visual storytelling perspective, a nice little transition. And here, again, another transition. The grasping of the tentacles that are clawing after her, that are trying to get a hold of her, becomes the grasping of the undead hands as they are clawing for Lucian. And again, with Lucian, I don't think there's that much left to say, because everything I've said before pretty much still applies. Again, the camera is very restrained in this bit, which it needs to be, because the action is pretty frantic. There's a lot of people and a lot of stuff on screen, and Lucian tends to move in sudden jolts and bursts. So the camera generally stays very steady in order to orient us. And also, notice the lovely little color transition here, where Lucian is, because of the light of his guns, and just in general, the color grading is more blue around here, whereas the closer we get to Thresh, the greener everything gets, which is his color theme. So here especially you get this conflict between the blue and the green, which is the conflict between the light and the undeath of Thresh, in a sense. Again, with Thresh, a lot of what he looks like he looks like a Games Workshop model. Like, he literally looks like something from Warhammer 40k or even Warhammer Fantasy, a miniature figure come to life. He looks very unrealistic in that sense, but what they've chosen to do, much like with Misfortune, who generally looks kind of cartoonish, they used her hair and the realism of her hair to sell it. With Blitzcrank, he looks completely like a cartoon, so they enveloped him with very realistic steam effects in order to sell the reality of the character. And then with Thresh, they've chosen to use very realistic fire effects to sell the reality of the character. And here, this final shot, which I'm sure will be a lot of people's desktop backgrounds, which is very well composed. And that's about it. And this is 27 minutes on this 2-minute piece of animation, as is usually the style with me. So if you've enjoyed this, you should feel extremely free to leave some comments down below. If there are any questions, anything you'd like me to talk more about, I'd be happy to respond to that. You can leave a like if you are so inclined, or dislike if that is more your thing. My name has been TVSkyn. Thank you very much for listening to me talk about this 2-minute animation short for half an hour, and I shall see you in the next video.